So a really important aspect of these visualizations we've made in Pokeit is that you can change around any of them really quickly once they're loaded. And so we've built some shortcuts for that by adding this toolbar up here with some quick access features such as adding a filter or adding a field or whatnot up here. But you can access all of this at once from over here in the settings panel. Now you access the settings panel by clicking the gear here, and then you get this sidebar that comes out. And what this is showing you is the three things that come together to make your visualization. So you see these three sections here. You have source, which is what fields and filters are being used to construct your data set. You have the layout, which dictates how you want your visualization to look. In this case, I want circles with different sizes and colors. We're going to focus on the presentation panel in this video. So the presentation panel is about how the source and the layout come together to build your visualization. You can click on it to go into a lot of detail about the presentation, so let's go ahead and do that. Now we see a lot of different sections. Each section is talking about a different aspect of the visualization, such as the x-axis, what's on the y-axis, what's being shown in this case as a circle on the graph, and then some circle-specific settings, such as the size and the color of each circle. And this is a really nice overview of everything that's coming together, all the different fields and how they're being used on your visualization here. But you can edit everything right from here as well. All you have to do is click on one of these and you get a list of the other fields in your source. And if you choose something different, in this case, why don't we choose aggression factor, we can then click update data and it will load the visualization, but instead of VPIP on the x-axis, now we have aggression factor. Furthermore, you can click this gear here next to a field for a whole bunch of settings for how that field is used. For example, this is where we have the flags on a visualization. We have a whole other video about this, but I'll show you a really quick example. I'm going to set it to say, highlight every player that has an aggression factor higher than 4. There. And that's really cool. But I'm going to turn that off right now. In addition to being able to edit the fields, you can also edit the properties of these aspects themselves. And you do that by clicking on the label itself. You see a little pencil icon here. Let's go into spectrum, for instance, and maybe choose a different spectrum to show the colors along. I like this one a lot. And now you can see that we have totally different colors there. Very cool. And maybe another quick example of this, we can click on radius and say we don't want circles bigger than 10 or 11 and maybe smaller than 3. So now it looks very different in the visualization. But I actually kind of like it at 25-ish in 1. We can go back to the presentation by clicking the back button in the corner. And now I'm going to hop into a different visualization real quick. Let's open up the stakes report here. And again, we're going to open up the presentation panel for the stakes report. And so what this visualization is showing me is different stats for myself across different stakes that I've played at. And one of these is Big Bet 100 here. This field by default is just showing me my average Big Bet 100 at each stake. And I can show something different for Big Bet 100 if I want by going over to the column section of the presentation panel and finding Big Bet 100 and then clicking field options here. Like I said a minute ago, by default it's showing me the average value for Big Bet 100 at every stake. But I can switch this under aggregate to standard deviation instead. And now I'll click update data and I have new values here. And this is showing me now the standard deviation for Big Bet 100 instead of just the average. You can see that the two no limit stakes that I've played have a much larger standard deviation than the limit games that I've played. And that's just because no limit is a lot crazier and there's a lot more variance in the types of pots you might win. Another thing I can do is go down to the winnings field, which right now is showing me the total amount or the net amount that I've won at every stake. And I'm going to click that gear again. And under aggregate, instead of standard deviation, I'm going to choose minimum. I'm going to choose min, or the minimum. So what this is going to show me when I click update data is the amount of my single worst hand at each of these stakes. So for example, the single worst hand I ever played at this stake, I lost $75 on. But maybe I'd rather look at max instead. So I'm going to switch that to max. And that makes me feel a little bit better there, seeing that I also won a hand for $77. So the last couple examples have shown off aggregate inside of this field pop-up here. Let's take a look at window next. And I'm going to hop back to the first visualization that we looked at to show off that one. So let's go into the presentation again. And then we'll open up aggression factor. And when I click on window, I have a whole lot of options here. The default is usually blank, meaning that you get the raw number. So, for example, this player here, Whoppers, has an aggression factor of 12, which is pretty big, and we're mapping it onto the x-axis as the number 12. But inside of window, we have some other choices, such as rank here. When I click update data, so everything just moved around, and instead of these numbers meaning a simple 12, for example, Whoppers here is instead being shown as the 597th player out of 615 in terms of aggression factor. So that's a really different way to look at your data, and not only did it change the value, but you saw the circles move, and visually it's a different way to look at everything as well. We'll go into more detail on what each of these can do in a different video, but there's a lot of really cool things you can do with the combination of aggregate and window here. Alright, so the last thing I wanted to point out, we're going to need hand browser for. So I'm going to load that real quick and open up the presentation panel. And by default, hand browser is showing me a list of all my hands, but with the most recent one at the top, and second most recent after that, and so on. Over here in the presentation panel, we have how the hand browser was built, and I'm going to look at winnings here. One thing I can do is sort by descending winnings. So what this should show us is starting with the hand where I've won the most hands, and then in decreasing amounts, since I've set it to descending. This is now, instead of most recent hands, most profitable hands. And I want to point out that it's slightly different, and there's some nuance to setting a sorting this way. I'm going to set this back to normal. Versus here in tables, you have the ability to change sorting by clicking on a column header here. And these are slightly different records than we saw a minute ago. And the reason for that is the final thing I want to show off in the presentation panel is all the way here at the bottom. And it's this concept of limit and sampling. With hand browser by default, we have set it to 10,000 hands limit. This can be really beneficial because let's say we had 1,000,000 hands in my database, and then I loaded hand browser. It might take 20 minutes for all the data for 1,000,000 hands to download from the server and build a hand browser that would probably run really slow. So by saying 10,000 here in the limit, I've told the visualization to only return 10,000 hands for me. When I do sorting here in the column headers by winnings, that's happening after I've said I just want the first 10,000 hands. In the hand browser case, the most recent 10,000 hands. But if I instead set it to descending here under winnings, this way is going to select from hands before that 10,000 limit is applied. And if there happens to be more than 10,000 of those, that's when the limit would hit. So now I have both turned on. So it's both the top 10,000 most profitable hands I've had, thanks to this sort here, and then the limit there. And then I've also sorted it by winnings. I guess that's a little superfluous. You can turn limit on and off if you want. Just be aware that it might make for a lot longer of a load time for you. But it can be beneficial too. For instance, if we go back to this player chart, we can turn on a limit of maybe 100. So this will take us down from 615 players to 100. And finally, there's this item sampling right underneath limit. And I've got it turned on right now. What this says is if there's more items than the limit allows for, in this case, we had the 615 players, but we only want 100 of them. Sampling, when it's turned on, will choose 100 random rows from that data set, in this case 615 players, and only return 100 random ones. We can click the gear to get a fresh 100, and again to see another fresh 100. And when it's turned off, it would return the first 100 that it came across. And then a super final note, you have this option for legend here. If you want to see the legend somewhere else, like at the top of your screen, you can do that. Or even if you want to hide the legend entirely and just focus on, what's going on in your main area, then that's cool too.